must rely on law enforcement to keep them safe and free from harm by others. As the Macomb County prosecutor, I am committed to bringing wrongdoers to justice. All accused of a crime are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Whether documented or undocumented, a person faces the same justice under the law. In Macomb County, we follow the law. That means we honor the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency with notice of an arrest of an undocumented person or persons. We are proud to work with our state and federal law partners as it relates to keeping the law and keeping the order. We need to be clear that bad actions by the undocumented should not have a chilling effect on those who came here legally, like our ancestors. However, the problem today is that law enforcement is challenging enough without adding immigration issues into the equation. That should never have happened here. This onslaught of undocumented crimes has brought a drastic impact on our law enforcement partners. The cost of illegals entering this country who have broke our laws has put law-abiding citizens at risk. Honest, hardworking, and good-spirited Americans have long provided legal immigrants with food, shelter, and medical care, etc. But the unlawful, undocumented cost of law enforcement and incarceration is truly something which must be stopped before law-abiding citizens go broke paying for crimes to secure justice of illegal immigrants, while we also house, feed, and provide them with medical care, destroying the very fiber of American citizenship and the journey to the American dream. The laws of immigration are clear, but they are broken all too easily by allowing undocumented individuals into our state, into our country, who then bring harm to others. I have a tough time enough of maintaining the law and order and providing justice to our own citizens here who run afoul of the law. Taking on additional burden of those that come into this country illegally and commit crimes cannot be justified. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight Macomb County law enforcement, who protects and serves honorably the residents and citizens of this country and this state. Having said that, I'm a proud product of immigrants who came here legally to achieve the American dream, and I applaud all who do. God bless everyone here, and God bless all of you who wear the uniform and the badge. Thank you.
Look, these guys are doing a good job, and they're doing everything they can to keep the people safe, but we have to remember that it's hard for them to do their job as well as they need to when they have a federal government that's making it so much harder. On day one, Kamala Harris, our border czar, suspended deportations. On day one, she proposed mass amnesty. On day one, she stopped building Donald Trump's border wall. And on day one, she proposed giving health care benefits and a whole host of other benefits to illegal aliens, encouraging them to come into our country. And now we're dealing with the consequences for it, even in places like Shelby Township, which the media would tell you is far away from the southern border and its problems. And geographically, of course, it is far away from the southern border, but it's not far away from its problems. I heard just today in the last couple of months about a mother and daughter who were just enjoying their day here in Shelby Township, and you had an illegal alien plow into them and kill this innocent mother and daughter. I talked earlier about this poor 11-year-old who had a heinous crime committed against this poor girl by an illegal alien, a person who was deported who shouldn't have even been in this country in the first place. You can go through the list of things that are happening even here, and the simple message is we could do so much better. So to the American people, I'd ask you something very simple. Give these guys a federal government that makes it easier for them to keep American communities safe and not harder. One of the most heartbreaking stories I've heard on the campaign trail, and I've only been at this a couple of weeks, but one of the most heartbreaking stories I heard was yesterday from two young kids, both teenagers. The youngest has been in 4 foster homes, and why have they been bouncing around? They've been bouncing around because their mother and father took fentanyl that was almost certainly brought in by the Mexican drug cartels, and that orphaned these poor children. And so to the American people who have a chance to choose a better path in November, I'd ask you to choose the candidate who will stop that fentanyl from coming into our communities, who will stop our parents from losing their lives to this terrible fentanyl overdose, and stop the children from dying as well. I'd ask you to vote for a candidate who wants to support our police officers, not make their lives harder. I'd ask you to support a candidate who wants to make it easier to deport illegal aliens and not harder. I'd ask you to support the candidate who has shown that he can deliver security in our streets. We just have to give him the opportunity to govern, and that's President Donald J. Trump. The contrast could not be more clear between a candidate. Every law enforcement agency is telling you Kamala Harris is bad news. She makes it harder to keep you safe. Donald Trump is good news. He makes it easier to keep you safe. We ought to give him a second term in office, and all of our communities will be safer and better and more prosperous because of it. So thank you all for what you do despite the policies of Kamala Harris. But I promise you, in just 6 months, the cavalry is coming. You're going to have a federal government who makes your life easier, not harder, but only if the American people support us and get us over the finish line this election. Now, I want to take some questions from the media, but before I do, just a couple of points. One, I'd like to start with Michigan reporters, people who are in this area. So if you are a Michigan reporter, raise your hand and I'll start with you. The second thing I want to say is, while we're on the topic of reporters, Kamala Harris had another scripted set of remarks before a teleprompter yesterday, and today marks 17 days where she has been the presumptive Democrat nominee and 17 days where she has refused to answer questions from the media. President Trump will go anywhere, into hostile audiences, into friendly audiences, and answer tough questions. I will go anywhere and answer tough questions because I respect the American people enough to say that I should have to earn your vote. I shouldn't be expected to be given your vote while I hide in a basement or stand in front of a teleprompter, which is exactly what Kamala Harris has done. So I'd ask all the reporters here to show a little bit of self-awareness and demand that Kamala Harris actually do the job of a presidential candidate and speak to the media and speak to reporters. Until she does, you guys have got to stop giving her a honeymoon and pretending that she's something she isn't. This is a person who said she supports the police, yet she promoted policies to defund the police. This is a person who says that she wants a secure border, but she has been the border czar for 3.5 years while it's been wide open. And this is a person who says that she wants secure American communities, yet all of the people who are the police officers who are ensuring that we have safe communities, they don't seem to like Kamala Harris. And you guys have got to ask her tough questions about why that is. The media honeymoon for a person who runs away from the American people is disgraceful. It's not just disgraceful for Kamala Harris, it's increasingly disgraceful on the part of the media. So with that, Michigan reporters, start with you, sir.
I'm from CNG Newspapers, and Iran and Hezbollah are in the news as the world waits for a threatened attack on Israel. You said on a radio talk show this week you suspect that a number of Iranian-related militias that have terrorist agents are within the United States thanks to the current administration. What do we know about these suspected Iranian agents or other terrorists and their leverage? And do you think they're preparing an October 7th style attack in the U.S.? And if so, how does the Trump administration, a future Trump administration or potential one, navigate that Iranian leverage on their foreign policy?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say that President Trump noticed that when he was in office, we did not have the world on fire. We did not have a war in the Middle East and a war in Europe and war threatening to break out in East Asia. President Trump was the candidate of peace and prosperity. He delivered peace all over the world. He would do it again if he was president of the United States. Now, what's going on in Israel, again, highlights the weakness of the Kamala Harris administration. Kamala Harris is a person who says she wants the war in Israel to be over with, and also that she wants to minimize civilian casualties. Well, I want those things too. Then why isn't she giving Israel the weapons it needs to minimize civilian casualties? And why isn't she giving Israel the weapons it needs to end this conflict quickly? The best thing for the United States of America is for Israel to end its war, to destroy Hamas, and then to rebuild the Abraham Accords of President Trump so that the Sunni Arab states and the Israelis can form a regional counterbalance to Iran. That is what is in the best interest of our country. That's what's in the best interest of Israel. And it's telling that Kamala Harris refuses to do what she needs to do to keep America and its allies safe. And the final point that I'll say is, yes, I believe that there are Iranian-backed militia groups in this country right now because we know thousands of people have come across the U.S. southern border who have ties to terrorism. Well, it's really endangers your country, and I fear we're going to have a very bad headline here and a lot of people who could lose their lives because Kamala Harris refuses to keep terrorists out of our country. It's disgraceful, but it highlights the fact that unless you have a border, there is no peace and there is no security for American citizens, even in a place as far north as Shelby Township, Michigan. Other questions? Yeah.
Detroit Free Press.
Thank you.
When Trump was at the NABJ conference, he was asked whether you'd be ready to assume the presidency on day one, and he responded by talking about how the vice president pick doesn't really impact the election outcome.
Sure.
Was that the response that you were hoping for from the former president?
Well, what the president has said, and I agree with him, is that most people are voting at the top of the ticket. Now, Tim Walz is a crazy radical, of course. He allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis, but most people are going to be voting for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump. I think it was a common sense observation. He said it before I was the pick. He said it after I was the pick, and I think he's absolutely right. Now, I will say that on the vice presidential issue, it's interesting what Tim Walz says about Kamala Harris. Tim Walz is a person, again, who promoted rioters burning down the biggest city in his state. This is a guy who wants to give driver's licenses to illegal aliens. This is a guy who wants to take children away from their parents if those parents don't consent to sex changes for minors. This is a radical human being who comes from the far left wing of the Democrat Party. And what Kamala Harris is telling all of us by selecting Tim Walz is that she bends the knee to the far left of the Democrat Party. She's done it every single time in government. She's done it in who she selected as her VP nominee, and she will do it if the American people give her a promotion to President of the United States. We don't have to guess at what Kamala Harris believes. The fact that she keeps on leaning on the most far left people in the Democrat Party tells us exactly who she is and what she stands for. Sir.
You're giving a policy speech on immigration essentially today. What is the plan from the Trump team to execute this mass deportation? What will that look like in the United States? How will you make that happen?
Well, I think it's very simple, actually. The first thing that you have to do, and the first thing that President Trump will do, is stop the massive inflow of illegal aliens in the first place. You got to stop the bleeding before you can actually fix the problem here, and we still have thousands of people coming across the border illegally every single day. So the first thing you do, you re-implement deportations, you finish construction of the border wall, and you stop proposing mass amnesty for millions of illegal aliens. That solves the majority of the border problem on day one. President Trump already did it, and he will certainly do it again. Now, to your point about what do you do with the people who are already here? I think it's important that we send a message that if you have come to this country illegally, if you plowed into an innocent mom and her daughter and they lost their lives because of your actions, the message from the Trump administration is simple. Pack your bags because in 4 months, you're going home. We do not consent to an invasion of this country for millions of people who shouldn't be here, and we are going to deport people. Now, you start with the people who are most dangerous. You start with the most violent criminals. You make it harder for businesses to hire illegal aliens, and you work your way down from there. And I think that's how you solve the problem of the people who are here. But if you're not willing to tell at least some of the people who are in this country illegally that you have to go back, then you don't have a real border policy. And unfortunately, that's what Kamala Harris has given this country. Sir.
Last night, Governor Walz suggested that because of your Ivy League education and your Silicon backing your political career, that you yourself are part of the elite. What are your first impressions of them trying to frame you this way to the American public?
Well, look, I came from a family where nobody in my family had ever gone to law school. I grew up in a poor family. The fact that Tim Walz wants to turn it into a bad thing, that I actually worked myself through college, through law school, and made something myself, to me, that's the American dream. And if Tim Walz wants to insult it, I think that's frankly pretty bizarre. Now, look, what really bothers me about Tim Walz, it's not even the positions that he's taken, though certainly he has been a far-left radical. You know what really bothers me about Tim Walz as a Marine who served his country in uniform? When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful to prepare your unit to go to Iraq, to make a promise that you're going to follow through, and then to drop out right before you actually have to go. I also think it's dishonest. Something, again, if you guys ever get an opportunity to ask Tim Walz or Kamala Harris some questions, he made this interesting comment that the Kamala Harris campaign put out there, and I bet they're regretting they put it out there now, because he said that and he was making a point about gun control, he said we shouldn't allow weapons that I used in war to be on America's streets. Well, I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? What was this weapon that you carried into war, given that you abandoned your unit right before they went to Iraq, and he has not spent a day in a combat zone? What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did. Sir. Could you speak a little louder? Sorry.
Will Jones from Local 4. I want
Yes,
to
sir.
talk a little bit about race. I was at the National Association of Black Journalists conference last
Yes,
week
sir.
where President Trump made some attacks on Vice President Harris's biracial heritage. You're married to an Indian American woman. You have biracial children. How do you explain his attacks, and what is your reaction to his attacks as a father of biracial children?
Yes, sir. So I am the father of biracial children. Actually, my wife is here today. That my kids are back home with my aunt today. And look, I was not bothered at all by what President Trump said, and I didn't take it as an attack on Kamala Harris's biracial background at all. What I took it as was an attack on Kamala Harris being a chameleon. She pretends to be one thing when she's in front of one audience. She pretends to be something else when she's in front of another audience. And I think he was observing the basic foundational reality that Kamala Harris pretends to be something different depending on which audience she's speaking to. Now, she has been able to hide this a little bit because for the past couple of weeks, she only speaks in front of a teleprompter. She never gives unscripted remarks, and she's hidden from the American media and from the American people. But we know she's a chameleon. We know she's a person who promised to defund the police and now wants to pretend she's a tough prosecutor. She said that she would be our border czar, and yet for 3.5 years, we have an open border. She said that she would bring some common sense and lower inflation to our economic policies, and yet she cast the deciding vote that raised interest rates, raised home prices, and raised food prices. Donald Trump said something very simple, totally inoffensive, but frankly, obviously true to me, which is that Kamala Harris is a chameleon. She's a fake, and the American people have to look at her record if we actually want to know how she stands on the issues, because her words simply can't be trusted. Sir.
How can you fake your race? If
I'm
she's
sorry?
both Indian and black, how can she fake her race?
She fakes who she is depending on the audience that she's in front of, and that's who she is, and that's who she's always been. Sir.
A little bit different here. You've been criticized as being a little too serious, maybe angry sometimes. What makes you smile? What makes you happy?
Well, I smile at a lot of things, including bogus questions from the media, man. I mean, look, I think if you watch a full speech that I give, I actually am having a good time out here, and I'm enjoying this. But look, sometimes you got to take the good with the bad. And right now, I am angry about what Kamala Harris has done to this country and done to the American southern border. And I think that most people in our country, they can be happy-go-lucky sometimes, they can enjoy things sometimes, and they can turn on the news and recognize that what's going on in this country is a disgrace. And if what Kamala Harris has done at the southern border, and if what Kamala Harris has done to raise the price of groceries and housing, if that doesn't bother you, then I think that you don't have a pulse, right? And so, look, I think my message to the American people is very simple on this, that President Trump in particular has the best sense of humor of anybody I've ever seen in American politics. He loves to joke. He loves to tell, he loves to make fun of everybody that's out there, and I think you got to do that from time to time. But he's also a guy who's very frustrated with what Kamala Harris has done to this country. Both of those things can be true, and I think most Americans can joke around but also be pissed off about the direction of this country. Thank you, sir. Ma'am?
Hi, Kimberly Craig, 7 News Detroit. Right here in Shelby Township, there's going to be a mother, a father, a senior citizen struggling to pay their bills, put food on the
Yes, ma'am.
table, pay the utility bills. When you speak of the prosperity in a Trump administration, what can you, speaking to that person, What does that look like?
Well, I think that, I'm 40 years old. I actually just had my 40th birthday, which I'm not too happy about. But I'm 40 years old, and for my entire life, there was this chart that had wages below corporate profits and below the size of government. And there was one 4-year period during my entire life where wages were actually going up, especially for people at the bottom and people at the middle. That was the 4 years when Donald Trump was president. And so my message to people who are struggling is, first of all, I know what it's like to struggle. My mamaw once negotiated with a Meals on Wheels person so that she could get more food from Meals on Wheels so that she could feed me and her. I certainly know what it's like to deal with skyrocketing grocery prices and skyrocketing rent. The solution to it is to give people higher paychecks. The solution to it is give people better take-home pay. The solution is to unleash American energy so that people aren't going to the grocery and seeing that eggs are 50% more than what they were a year and a half ago, right? You've got to bring down prices to give people basic prosperity. And the way you do that is really unleashing American energy, unleashing American farmers, and not spending like a drunken sailor, which is what Kamala Harris has done during her time in office. We really do know that it's the least of these. The Bible calls them the least of these who have suffered the most under Kamala Harris's affordability crisis. And President Trump and I, that is priority number one, is to make groceries and gas and rent more affordable for normal Americans. If you work hard and play by the rules, this very simple principle should apply. If you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to live a good life in this country. And unfortunately, a lot of people right now are working hard and they're playing by the rules, but they can't afford groceries and they can't afford rent because of bad policy in Washington, D.C. We promise that we're going to change that. One last point I want to make on this, because I don't think that we talk in the media, we don't talk about it enough in politics, but housing is through the roof, and housing is destroying people's savings and their ability to put a good house, put a good roof over their kid's head. So here's the thing. Why is housing so expensive in this country? Housing is so expensive in this country for two reasons. Number one, Kamala Harris pursued policies that raised interest rates, which make mortgages unaffordable for normal Americans. That's number one. And number two, we have let in 20 million illegal aliens who are competing with American citizens for scarce housing. You do those two things and you see the rent crisis that you see in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. It is a disgrace. President Trump and I promise we will fix it. It's simple public policy. It's just got to be smarter, and it's got to look out for American citizens first. Sir?
Colin Jackson, Michigan Public Radio Network. Michigan is a state that's going to be one on the margins. It's projected to be a close race. When former President Trump was in Detroit a few months back, he was talking to black voters. He was tried very hard to tie President Biden to the crime bill while taking credit for criminal justice reform. Right now, you're here in Shelby Township with a tough on crime, mass deportation message. Do you feel like that's going to land with voters of color that the campaign will need to win?
Well, look, I think my message to voters of color is very similar to my message to voters everywhere in Michigan, which is we want to redeliver peace and prosperity, right? Voters of color really benefit when wages are rising. Voters of color really benefit when normal people can afford to buy a home, and we want to bring back some of those common sense policies. But if you look at the statistics, when you allow rioters to set fire to a city, or when the police are not empowered to do their job, it is very often voters of color that suffer disproportionately, right? It is voters of color who benefit the most from public safety, and I think that we have to get some common sense back. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we don't want police to have good relationship. Tough on crime does not mean tough on every single person who lives in a neighborhood with high crime. But when I talk to people in neighborhoods with high crime, often, not always, of course, voters of color, they actually love the police. They've got good relationships with the police. Of course, there are bad apples here and there, but most people recognize the police are there to keep them safe. And if we don't make it possible for the police to lock up the bad guys, the murderers, the armed robbers, then it is very often black voters, especially in the state of Michigan, who suffer the most. You know, one thing that really bothers me about the left's narrative on criminal justice reform and a lot of their attacks on police is, again, that it is very often black voters who suffer the most when the police aren't empowered to do their job. We have got to change this. There's an idea out there, I think, that Americans often forget that the worst violent criminals right? It's a very small group of people who commit the most egregious and most often commit the worst violent crimes. Nobody, black, white, or anything else, wants us to do anything other than lock up the most violent criminals. You do that, and you empower the police to do that, you solve a whole host of the violent crime problem, and voters of color, I think, benefit from that as much as anybody. Sir.
Senator Garrett Haake from NBC News. You have repeatedly suggested that the only reason Kamala Harris didn't pick Josh Shapiro to be her running mate is because of his Jewish faith. Do you have any evidence to support that assertion that a person who's married to a Jewish man is somehow anti-Semitic or bowing to anti-Semites?
Well, I reject the premise of the question. I did not say that that was the only reason that Kamala Harris didn't choose Josh Shapiro. So you should, take a little less DNC talking points when you ask your questions and ask a real question. I have suggested that Kamala Harris was motivated, or at least her party was motivated by anti-Semitism. And the evidence that I offer for that is what dozens of Democratic activists said in the run-up to her selecting her nominee. There were multiple grassroots activists, multiple media personalities, multiple people with influence in the Democrat Party who suggested that she should not choose Josh Shapiro because of his ethnic background. And look, I don't care what your ethnic background is. I know Donald Trump doesn't care what your ethnic background is. I do not want to live in a country where we're choosing who the next VP is based on skin color or ethnic heritage. Choose based on merit. And the fact that so many prominent leaders in the far left felt empowered to talk about Shapiro's ethnic heritage is a disgrace, and I think it's a scandal for the Democrat Party. Yes, I do. Last question. Ma'am, the blue and yellow there?
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Janelle James, reporter for Bridge, Michigan. And Michigan has about 91,000 immigrants, which counts for about 1.2% of our population. So what do you say to the people in Michigan who say immigration really isn't that big of a problem here?
Well, I appreciate the question, Janelle, and I'd say that, interestingly, legal immigrants often suffer the most from illegal immigration. If you look at the effect on legal immigrants' wages, if you look at the jobs that they're working in, and if you look at the communities that they're living in that are most affected by the public safety problems caused by illegal immigration, my message to legal immigrants was, one, we love to have you. You're very welcome, and we're happy that you came through the proper channels, but this illegal immigration problem is very often, it falls hardest on legal immigrants more than anybody else. And so my message is our anti-illegal immigration platform is actually going to make your life better. It's going to make your wages go up. It's going to make public safety in your communities better. Look, I'm married to the daughter of legal immigrants. I do believe in my heart that legal immigration can enrich this country, but not illegal immigration, which is what Kamala Harris has done all over this country. It's made us less safe. It's driven down wages for working Americans, and it's made our communities less prosperous. We've got to stop this craziness. President Trump and I are going to do it. And on that topic, I know that was the last question, but let me just offer one final observation again about these guys in the back. Law enforcement is fundamentally a team effort. You need the federal government to do what it needs to do. You need the state government and the local governments to be empowered to keep people safe. What is so broken about American public safety, it's not our local police officers who are doing great things. It's not our state leadership who's very often doing great things. It is the federal government allowing criminals who shouldn't be here, promoting sex trafficking and drug trafficking at our southern border. It is making these guys' jobs so much more difficult. And it's making it difficult in ways that we don't even always see. I talked earlier to these guys behind me a little bit earlier. We talked about the fact that when they have illegal aliens and they have to provide food and housing for those illegal aliens, that's precious tax dollars that don't go into hiring additional officers that they need. So we have been put in a zero-sum situation by Kamala Harris where we can prioritize the interests of American citizens and their safety, or we can prioritize the health benefits of illegal aliens. We have got to prioritize our own citizens. This crime problem is a policy choice of Kamala Harris. We can do so much better. Elect Donald Trump, and we will. God bless you guys, and thank you.